Part 2, Organizational Greenhouse Gas Accounting, ISO 14064-1. What is greenhouse gas accounting? Greenhouse gas accounting refers to processes used to measure how much carbon dioxide equivalents an organization emits. An organizational GHG emissions assessment measures the organization's carbon footprint by quantifying the total amount of greenhouse gases the organization produces, whether directly or indirectly. Benefits of greenhouse gases accounting. Comprehensive GHG accounting allows the organization to monitor their climate strategy and make adjustments to continue to improve their climate performance. GHG accounting aids the organization to identify their GHG emission hotspots across their business and increase the potential for emissions reductions. There are a number of different standards and voluntary codes of practice that have been developed to support organizations in estimating their carbon footprint. Some of the commonly used GHG frameworks are flexible mechanisms under Kyoto Protocol, emissions trading, joint implementation, and the Clean Development Mechanism. Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO 14064, and ISO 14069. GHG Protocol is the one most used and accepted methodologies, jointly proposed by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development under participation of government agencies, companies, NGOs, and academic institutions around the world. The GHG Protocol and the ISO 14064 standards are largely overlapping. However, there are some differences that should be highlighted. First of all, the GHG Protocol constitutes a voluntary standard, while the ISO 14064 can be used for certification purposes. Second, due to its scope, the GHG Protocol methodology is often adopted by governments, NGOs, and other organizations, while ISO 14064 is mostly used by industrial enterprises. There are also minor differences regarding the setting of organizational boundaries and calculation methods in these two methodologies. Today we will be discussing on ISO 14064. Start with you to know what is ISO and what is ISO standard. ISO is an international standard-setting body composed of representatives from various national standard organizations. It is a corporation independent to the government whose main focus is to develop internationally recognized standards. Introduction to ISO 14060 family. Background. Climate change arising from anthropogenic activity has been identified as one of the world's most significant challenges and will continue to affect businesses and citizens over future decades. Climate change has implications for both human and natural systems and could lead to significant impacts on resource availability, economic activity, and human well-being. In response, international, regional, national, and local initiatives are being developed and implemented by public and private sectors to mitigate greenhouse gas, GHG, concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere, as well as to facilitate adaptation to climate change. There is a need for an effective and progressive response to the urgent threat of climate change on the basis of the best available scientific knowledge. ISO produces documents that support the transformation of scientific knowledge into tools that will help address climate change. The ISO 14060 family provides clarity and consistency for quantifying, monitoring, reporting, and validating or verifying GHG emissions and removals to support sustainable development through a low-carbon economy and to benefit organizations, project proponents, and interested parties worldwide. The use of the ISO 14060 family. 1. Enhances the environmental integrity of GHG quantification. 2. Enhances the credibility, consistency, and transparency of GHG quantification, monitoring, reporting, verification, and validation. 3. Facilitates the development and implementation of GHG management strategies and plans. 4. Facilitates the development and implementation of mitigation actions through emission reductions or removal enhancements. 5. Facilitates the ability to track performance and progress in the reduction of GHG emissions and/or increase in GHG removals. Next, the applications of the ISO 14060 family. Corporate decisions, such as identifying emission reduction opportunities and increasing profitability by reducing energy consumption. Risks and opportunities management, such as climate-related risks, including financial, regulatory, supply chain, product and customer, litigation, reputational risks and its opportunity for business. Voluntary initiatives, such as participation in voluntary GHG registries or sustainability reporting initiatives. GHG markets, such as the buying and selling of GHG allowances or credits. Regulatory or government GHG programs, such as credit for early action, agreements or national and local reporting initiatives. Let's see the relationship among the ISO 14060 family of GHG standards. ISO 14064. 1. Details principles and requirements for designing, developing, managing, and reporting organization-level GHG inventories. It includes requirements for determining GHG emission and removal boundaries, quantifying an organization's GHG emissions and removals, and identifying specific company actions or activities aimed at improving GHG management. It also includes requirements and guidance on inventory quality management, reporting, internal auditing, and the organization's responsibilities and verification activities. ISO 14064-2. Details principles and requirements for determining baselines and monitoring, quantifying and reporting of project emissions. It focuses on GHG projects or project-based activities specifically designed to reduce GHG emissions and/or enhance GHG removals. It provides the basis for GHG projects to be verified and validated. ISO 14067 defines the principles, requirements and guidelines for the quantification of the carbon footprint of products. ISO 14067 aims to quantify GHG emissions associated with the life cycle stages of a product, beginning with resource extraction and raw material sourcing and extending through the production, use, and end-of-life phases of the product. ISO 14064-3 details requirements for verifying GHG statements related to GHG inventories, GHG projects, and carbon footprints of products. It describes the process for verification or validation, including verification or validation planning, assessment procedures, and the evaluation of organizational, project, and product GHG statements. ISO 14065 defines requirements for bodies that validate and verify GHG statements. Its requirements cover impartiality, competence, communication, validation and verification processes, appeals, complaints, and the management system of validation and verification bodies. It can be used as a basis for accreditation and other forms of recognition in relation to the impartiality, competence, and consistency of validation and verification bodies. ISO 14066 specifies competence requirements for validation teams and verification teams. It includes principles and specifies competence requirements based on the tasks that validation teams or verification teams have to be able to perform. ISO 14069 describes the principles, concepts, and methods relating to the quantification and reporting of direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions for an organization. It provides guidance for the application of ISO 14064-1 to greenhouse gas inventories at the organization level, for the quantification and reporting of direct emissions, energy indirect emissions, and other indirect emissions. In this video we'll be focusing on ISO 14064-1. Specification with guidance at the organizational level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removal. The previous edition, ISO 14064-1, 2006, has been cancelled and replaced with the second edition, ISO 14064-1, 2018. Next, we'll move to ISO 14064-1 principles. 1. Relevance. The organization need to select the GHG sources, GHG sinks, GHG reservoirs, data, and methodologies appropriate to the needs of the intended user. 2. Completeness. The organization needs to include all relevant GHG emissions and removals. 3. Consistency. The organization needs to have consistency to enable meaningful comparisons in GHG-related information. 4. Accuracy. Accuracy is needed to reduce bias and uncertainties as far as is practical. 5. Transparency. Transparency is important to disclose sufficient and appropriate GHG-related information to allow intended users to make decisions with reasonable confidence. The GHG inventory boundaries divided into two: the organizational boundaries and the reporting boundaries. Organizational boundaries. The organization shall define its organizational boundaries. The organization may comprise one or more facilities. Facility-level GHG emissions or removals may be produced from one or more GHG sources or sinks. The organization shall combine its facility-level GHG emissions and removals by one of the following approaches. First, control. The organization takes into account all GHG emissions and/or removals from facilities that have financial or operational control. Second, equity share. The organization accounts for its portion of GHG emissions and/or removals from respective facilities. Reporting boundaries. Establishing reporting boundaries. The organization shall establish and document its reporting boundaries, including the identification of direct and indirect GHG emissions and removals associated with the organization's operations. Direct GHG emissions and removals. The organization shall quantify direct GHG emissions separately for CO2, CH4, N2O, NF3, SF6, and other appropriate GHG groups, HFCs, PFCs, etc., in tons of CO2 equivalent. The organization should also quantify GHG removals. Indirect GHG emissions. The organization shall apply and document a process to determine which indirect emissions to include in its GHG inventory. GHG inventory categories. GHG emissions shall be aggregated into the following categories at the organizational level: direct GHG emissions and removals, indirect GHG emissions from imported energy, indirect GHG emissions from transportation, indirect GHG emissions from products used by the organization, indirect GHG emissions associated with the use of products from the organization, and indirect GHG emissions from other sources. The GHG inventory's categories is summarizes into this diagram.